Hey, this is Mark Iskowitz. Rare diseases marketing has always been about serving underserved communities. But what if you're a company bringing a meaningful improvement to an already well served orphan drug market? That's the situation BioCryst Pharmaceuticals is facing with its first product launch, and the debut has required it to rethink the approach to how rare diseases drugs are promoted. Approved last December, its medicine, Orladeyo, is an oral once daily therapy for hereditary angioedema, a rare genetic disease that can lead to unpredictable and potentially life threatening swelling in various parts of the body. HAE, which affects about 1 in 50,000 people in the world, was already well served by some pretty large players. But Orladeyo is the first pill, whereas the incumbents are subcutaneous injections. So expectations for the drug were high. One analyst said Orladeyo could grab a third of the preventive HAE market by the end of 2021. But something interesting is happening. On its recent third quarter earnings call, the company said it's raised its projections for Orladeyo. The drug, which launched barely 12 months ago, has a real shot of not just earning a slice of the HAE prevention market, but of rocketing to the head of the pack and becoming the leader in the category. I'm Mark Iskowitz, editor at large, and welcome to the MMM podcast, medical marketing and media show about healthcare marketing writ large. This week on the show, we'll talk with BioCryst's Chief Commercial Officer, Charlie Geyer, about the strategy behind the drug's impressive debut and how analytics are helping his company rethink the rare disease drug launch. But first, some housekeeping items. The results of MMM's fourth annual Best Places to Work program are now live on our site. You can check out pics of the best small, mid-size, and large agencies, along with life sciences support firms, as rated by those who know them best, the employees themselves. And once you finish reading the winners, check out the Best Places to Work feature story for trends, data points, and more by visiting the all-new mmm-online.com. Charlie, welcome to the MMM podcast.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Great to have you. So many rare disease therapeutic categories are underserved. HAE is unusual in that it has 8 drugs on the market. When you were planning Orladeyo's launch, say 12 to 18 months ago, were you saying to yourself, this isn't the typical rare disease launch?
Well, you're right. Yeah, Orladeyo became the eighth drug, and so we knew that we had to be really smart. We had to stand out because you're right. This isn't the typical rare disease. This isn't about going out and finding the patients. At least in the U.S. market, it's a pretty mature marketplace. Most of the patients are diagnosed. There are a lot of great drugs on the market already. And so we set out to, even though we're a small company, to be the smartest in the space, to really understand patients, to really understand the HAE treaters, and frankly, everything about the market. So because we knew we had a great drug, we just wanted to make sure that we could get out there and get started quickly. And so we've been preparing with data and analytics for years, actually going back to 2015, doing some really big market research surveys with both patients and doctors, primary research, secondary research, all to prepare for achieving what we always knew could be a great success.
As we said during the intro, yours was the first oral medicine in a market of largely injectable products, most of which were effective at prevention, all of which presumes that physicians and HAE patients were currently satisfied with the available therapies. What was your analytical market research telling you might be the movable middle, so to speak? What did you see that others may not have in terms of demand?
Yeah, so Mark, what we really set out to do is understand who might want to switch to the market. And as you were asking about and we talked about the mature marketplace, we knew that at the time of launch, already 60% of the patients in the marketplace were on one of these injectable prophylaxis products. The market had moved towards preventing attacks, which is great for patients. And so what we really wanted to understand is, would those patients on these injectable prophylaxis products, would some of them switch? These are really good products. And so as we did our market research, we found in these big surveys, we found that patients actually were quite satisfied with those drugs. And it makes sense because if you think about the history of HAE, 10 or 15 years ago, most of these patients had nothing. They were having these attacks. as you said up front, they're debilitating, they can be life-threatening. So patients, were always living with that fear of an attack. It affected their lives. Many of them had family members in the past who had tragically died from this disease. So having effective therapy, what we found was there was an incredible amount of gratefulness amongst patients, grateful that the market had evolved to this place, and frankly, gratefulness amongst the physicians too, that after years of struggling, they could get patients to a place where they were well taken care of. But then, as we got into our surveys, as satisfied as people were, what we discovered is, patients were looking for what was next. And part of this is because of those 7 previous products to launch over the last 10 or 15 years, many of them had gotten used to moving from one product to the next, and what was the next thing to come
Now back to our show.
out here. About 2 years ago, we did a big survey with 100 HAE patients in the United States. About 75 of those patients were already on one of these injectable prophylaxis products. So for example, 30 of the patients were on Takhzyro. Takhzyro is a great drug. Of those 30 patients, 27 of the 30 said they were very satisfied with Takhzyro, measured on a Likert scale from 0 to 10. They measured at an 8, 9, or 10, really satisfied. But then when we showed them the profile of what would become Orladeyo, half of them wanted to switch. They were very interested in switching over to Orladeyo. And what this told us again is patients wanted something more, and there was a real burden of treatment that many of them were dealing with. I won't say they were suffering from, but they were dealing with it on a daily basis. So it's like, I have to prepare my medicines. I have to remember to take it out of the refrigerator. I have to schedule the time to do that. The injections aren't comfortable. That wasn't the biggest barrier, but it's not something people like, but they would deal with. But the idea of having an oral drug to take away a lot of this just meant for many of them, they could envision living a more normal life. And that was what was so important to them.
Sure. So it was that burden of care that they were just kind of dealing with, and they were satisfied, and they just felt like, okay, this is what we have to deal with in order to prevent these attacks. And then Orladeyo, came along, and it has the edge when it comes to convenience, but not necessarily efficacy. How did you overcome that disadvantage?
It's there is that perception, or there has been that perception that number one, oral drugs sometimes are perceived as less effective than injectables. And when we got the top line efficacy for Orladeyo, it did look like maybe it didn't seem to be as effective as some of the other drugs. But when we got those top line data, we wondered, all right, so why are so many patients staying on this drug in clinical trials? They had other options. They could have dropped out. They could have gone to one of those injectable therapies. And so we dug into the clinical data more. And what we found is that separately from the top line efficacy, if you looked at how patients were doing compared to their baseline, these patients were going from a baseline attack rate of about 3 attacks per month, and they were getting down in the first 6 months of treatment down to 1 attack per month. So pretty significant for patients. And then if we looked at all of the people who were really responding, 50% of the patients had a 70% or more reduction in their attacks. So really significant numbers just within the first 6 months. And that combined with the improvement in the burden of treatment and the ability to just take 1 pill a day was really significant to patients. And so we knew we had something that was actually more effective. And certainly in the minds of patients, it was meeting their needs, which was what's most important.
Yeah, right. Was the added convenience factored into your price? Can you say where you came in relative to the others?
I can say that, Orladeyo is the least expensive prophylactic product on the market. These are all expensive drugs, and so it's still an expensive drug because we think it drives an incredible amount of value for patients in terms of preventing attacks and helping them live their lives. So it was a factor, but frankly, more the factor of it's the latest drug to hit the market. And what payers always told us is, we understand you've got an oral drug here, They expected us to try to charge a premium for that. We didn't, but they said, we understand the value of prophylaxis and we'll reimburse for this product, and they're widely reimbursing for Orladeyo.
That's great. Now, partnering closely with the patient community, like advocacy groups, online communities, etc., has long been a staple of orphan drug marketing. How did you get the word out to patients?
We've been working with the patient community going back over 10 years at BioCryst, and I have to say that in HAE, particularly for a really rare disease, the HAEA and the HAEI have got to be about the best patient organizations that I've ever seen in my career. So we're very fortunate to be coming into a space where there was already a really well organized patient community, patient organization doing great things for them. But as a company, we've been going to their meetings, the HAEA's patient summits that they do every 2 years, going back almost 10 years. And it's actually kind of almost a founding story around BioCryst. Our CEO, John Stonehouse, was at one of these meetings about a decade ago. And he talked about this vision of bringing an oral drug to prevent attacks, this vision of one pill a day to help prevent attacks. And the patients were there in the audience, and he always describes it as, people kind of smiling, laughing, sort of shaking their heads, going, "No way, no way!" That's kind of our dream. And after that, he had the mother of a patient come up to him and say, "This is something that we've been waiting for, and you need to go fast because we're waiting for this." And so it's been something. Those words of the patient have driven us all the way through this process. So since then, we've partnered closely with the patient organization. Again, they do great work. And so we don't want to duplicate work that they're doing, for one thing. And they've been really helpful to us as we've done market research, for example, because they have the relationship with such a large base of patients. So they've been really helpful helping us recruit for our research studies, providing insights about the patient community. And they were instrumental in our clinical trials, and they've done this for all clinical trials, helping get the word out about the trials and helping find patients to enroll in these clinical trials. So honestly, we could not have done it without this organized and active patient community.
So it sounds like patients wanted an oral therapy. On the other hand, research suggested that physicians were adequately managing their HAE patients with the available injectables. How did you balance that disconnect, if you will?
I mean, you're right again, and back to the point, physicians were grateful too. They'd gotten patients to this point, and the great majority of their patients, they did feel like they're managing well, and they were. Rather than, how do we get physicians to understand the importance of an oral prophylactic medicine for patients? We start, rather than diving straight into the data, we start talking more about the burden, and setting up the story about the burden of disease, showing physicians actually some of our research that nearly 100% of patients would prefer, if they could, to treat their disease with an oral medicine rather than an injectable. And then here's why. Here are all some of those burdens. It's not just about being afraid of needles. That's a very small part of the market. It's really more about, again, that preparation, the scheduling, the inability to travel without having refrigerated medicine along with them. All of these things added to patients' burden. So we get physicians readily agree to that. Then we show them the data, like I've described, the responder analysis, in addition to the fact that this is an oral, starts to change their mind about an oral disease. And then more recently, we've put out 96-week data from our clinical trial. And what it shows is that patients get down to basically an 80% reduction, sustained 80% reduction in attacks. With most months, half or more of the patients are attack-free. And physicians have told us recently, looking at these 96-week data, they're like, this really changes the story. So not every physician moves at the same pace, but what we're finding is if physicians have, pretty much all of them have at least one patient, sometimes many more, who they see as being right for Orladeyo. They start with one, they see the good experience, and it leads to more. We've had many physicians prescribe it for multiple patients within their practice. As that word starts to spread, we think more and more will do so.
So it was really a data-driven approach. And I imagine your rivals aren't sitting back here. This is BioCryst's first offering in the HAE area. It's also the company's only marketed product. You're competing against Takeda, which has an entire HAE portfolio, including one of the current market-leading drugs. You all were the underdog. How did you compete against these more established rivals?
I mean, you're right. Takeda is a big company. They've got historically they've got the biggest portfolio. They have a relationship going back with patients and physicians going back years. So a few things. Back to my point, number one, we wanted to make sure that we were as smart as anybody. So we really understood the community really well, and I think we did that through our research and our preparations. We understood where all the prescribers, the treaters of HAE were. So we had really, we spent a lot of time understanding how to build our sales team, how many people we needed. In a rare disease like this, it's not an arms race. It's not about who's got the biggest sales force or anything else. You don't need massive teams. You just need really good teams. And that's the other thing that we did is we made sure we hired great people on the commercial side. While this may be BioCryst first launch, it's not the team's first launch. This is a team that has launched multiple drugs in multiple companies across the board. And everyone who came here to BioCryst came here because they saw the ability to launch an oral drug into this space is really exciting. They wanted to do that. They wanted to be able to build BioCryst because Orladeyo is our first drug, but it won't be our last. And this idea of bringing oral drugs to rare diseases, building a company, helping patients is what really motivated them. And we got that team on early. So, we made sure that our commercial team was in place about a year and a half before launch. Our sales team was in place 6 months before launch. So they could go out and start profiling customers and establishing some of those relationships so that by the time the drug was approved, they were ready to go and start promoting from day one. And it's paid off.
Can you talk about how marketing analytics is used to facilitate that process, to target your commercial efforts, perhaps, identifying which patients are relevant for therapy and kind of making sure you're making the most efficient use of your marketing spend?
Yeah, absolutely. So our analytics team has done some great work over the years. One of the things that we did about 3 years ago is there'd always been this number in the literature saying that the prevalence of HAE is about 1 in 50,000. And it's one of those numbers, no one's ever quite sure where it came from, but starts to be referenced. And so it became the truth. But we weren't satisfied with that. We wanted to know a little more clearly how many patients really are out there and who treats them. And so we did a really big third-party claims analysis, looking at diagnosis codes, looking at evidence of HAE-specific therapies, looking at laboratory testing data, making sure that all of these data were repeated multiple times. So this wasn't just one kind of rule out patients. These were really HAE patients. And what we came up with is there are about 7,500 diagnosed and treated HAE patients in the US. Another part of that research that we got is who are the physicians who are treating those patients. So what the team found is there are about 500 physicians that treat about 50% of those diagnosed and treated HAE patients. And then a few thousand who kind of are the long tail of physicians who treat one or two of the patients at a time. But we really use this to focus our targeting, build our sales force, and then measuring results based on this. And I think that's part of the reason that we got out of the gate really quickly.
And then on the marketing side, what would you say your key message is? And kind of what can you speak to some of the channels that you're using to get that key message out, kind of how you're differentiating from standard of care?
Yeah, so our message again is it's around first of all, there's a burden of therapy that patients have. Patients should be on most patients should be on prophylaxis, but the injectables come with a certain burden, as we've talked about. We talk about the efficacy and the safety of Orladeyo, and have a really balanced discussion around that, and with increasing data like the 96-week data that I described. And then a really important point around our marketing and kind of serving the patients that we heard prior to launch from both physicians and patients is the access process to get approved from the insurers to get access to these prophylaxis products in the past had been a real challenge. And so a lot of the patients and doctors were afraid, like, okay, I already got this other drug, it's approved, and now I don't want to I want to be on an oral, but I don't want to switch because I'm afraid that I'll lose my insurance, I won't be able to get back, all those types of things. So we made sure that we built a program with our patient services program. We have a sole source specialty pharmacy that does nothing but focuses on rare disease patients like HAE patients. And the services that they and our market access team have provided have helped physicians and patients get access much more quickly than they expected. And so that becomes a big part of our marketing story too, which is we're going to help you get access. We're going to help the patients get access. We're going to take a lot of the burden off of you. This is going to go faster than you expected. And you're always going to get to talk with the same person when you go back, which is one of the complaints that they had. So from a patient need perspective, the product value, that it's much more than just an oral, but it's about lowering the burden, and it's about preventing attacks with just one pill a day. And then we're going to help you get access without a burden. All of that together is what gives both patients and doctors confidence, and is the core part of our story.
Great, great. Okay. Was this a unique case study, would you say, or do your learnings from the launch of Orladeyo suggest that the playbook has changed for marketing future rare disease therapies?
I think for us, the playbook hasn't changed or won't change, and we expect to launch many. We have a pipeline coming behind Orladeyo of other oral drugs for rare diseases, and we expect to apply most of this playbook again and again and again. I think that the Orladeyo launch, though, for others maybe can be a lesson that you should really look carefully at what the market opportunity here is, and really listen to patients. And so if we had accepted a niche of patients who were either just those afraid of needles or just those dissatisfied with injectable drugs, our market opportunity would have been a fraction of what it was. But we knew we had a good product here. We heard it from the patients. We figured out how to position this product to the broad market. And that's what's leading to success. We weren't afraid to go after market leadership. And so I think maybe that's the thing. Even in a crowded market, if you have a truly differentiated product, this is something that you can launch much more broadly than maybe conventional wisdom would suggest.
Sure. And one last question for you, Charlie. Some may be thinking, how much of the success of this launch came down to fulfilling that unmet need, for the oral option, for an oral HAE formulation versus your skill as marketers?
I think in the end, it's always about first the unmet need. The skill is just hearing the unmet need, even if it's not expressed always in so many words from patients or doctors. This isn't about convincing people to want something that they didn't want. it's to really listen and maybe get patients and physicians to realize that they wanted something that they didn't realize was possible. And so sometimes, I don't want to over dramatize this, but sometimes we say it's like 15 years ago. Did anyone want an iPhone? Our phones were, at that point, they were small, they worked, you could call anybody, you got pretty good coverage, they weren't too expensive. So could we have imagined an iPhone? Maybe not, but once the iPhone came out, it was clearly something that we all wanted, right? And thought we needed. it's really listening for the opportunity, not just the words that they say, but imagining what could be, and that the skill in marketing is putting that in front of them, in front of the patients, in front of the doctors, and executing on that plan.
As Steve Jobs famously said, getting people to want something they didn't know they wanted is the whole thing, right?
That's right. That's right. So now we know. Now we know in rare disease. So that's the change for the future. That this is possible even in crowded marketplaces. That oral drugs are kind of a blast from the past in a way. But when you have really good oral drugs that address what's going on with the disease, they address the needs of the patient. There's a great opportunity for them in rare disease.
Hmm. Listen to what the market is telling you. Great. All right. Well, thank you for joining me, Charlie. This was a really fascinating discussion.
Thanks, Mark. I really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. That's it for this week. If you like this episode, please give it a thumbs up. Better yet, subscribe on your podcasting platform of choice and help others discover the show. The MMM podcast is produced by Deborah Stoll, Bradley Weems, and Gordon Thaler. We're out every week. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.